Well, hello, human biology class. This is the last of the urinary system lectures. After this, we'll have an exam at the end of this week, well, on Friday as scheduled, and I'll give you an email with more instructions on that. The last video I did, I got busted by the YouTube police for playing about 15 seconds of Hotel California. So if there's a strange blank space in there when we're talking about the loop of Henle, that's what's going on. I had to delete it. So anyway, I may have some troubles with the cell war video too, though I have a workaround for that. So make sure you watch that quick, because I might have to reload that a different way. Anyway, we're on the urinary system, and just to review, last time, well, the two previous times, we've been talking about the kidneys and the different structures within the kidney, and we were looking at the part of the kidneys, the three parts: the cortex, the medulla, and the pelvis. Mostly within the cortex we found the nephron, and we talked about it dipping down into the medulla and how that affected the makeup of the filtrate. If I go to a different slide, maybe I'll go to this one. When we look at that nephron, the filtrate, what comes out of the glomerulus right here, what gets squeezed out because of sufficient blood pressure and is able to pass through the foot cells, the podocytes, is collected in the Bowman's capsule. It travels down the remainder of the nephron, the near twisted tube, the proximal convoluted tubule, down the loop of Henle, the far twisted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, and we left off last time talking about the collecting duct. Again, just to reiterate, what actually gets out of, either is pumped out or moves out passively out of this nephron, is collected by the circulatory system and returned to that circulatory system. So it's important to keep in mind what goes where. Filtrate, the stuff that came out here, is sort of separated or sorted. What your body wants to keep, it returns to the bloodstream. What it does not want to keep, it leaves in the nephron, and it is excreted as urine. Okay, so last time we talked about the collecting duct. I showed you that little clip of Bear Grylls again. Interesting enough that YouTube didn't flag me on that one yet. It might cut that one out too. But if you remember, just making the point that Bear Grylls did not do himself any good, because his body will concentrate his urine. If you remember, he said at the beginning of the video that he was getting dehydrated. And what his body's going to do in response to that is pull more water out of the collecting duct here and return it to the bloodstream. Well, if you pull more water out, that's going to concentrate the salts and wastes that are in here and make it salty. And he said it tasted salty. And so that makes sense, I hope, that he did not do himself any good by drinking his own urine. So that's the sort of the end of the nephron here. The collecting duct, each of these tubes right here is a different nephron hooking into an ever enlarging collecting duct. And the collecting duct then eventually merges with the renal pelvis. So each of these collecting ducts, each of these little limbs here will be from another nephron. They carry their goods, and it all gets dumped into the renal pelvis. So here's an actual renal pelvis. Here's an artist's rendition of a renal pelvis with the multiple passageways to other parts of the kidney. All the urine collects here, passes down the ureter to the bladder. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And if we go back to a former image then of the bladder, this is what it looks like. So right here is one ureter coming from one kidney. Here's another ureter from another kidney, and that bladder, if you remember from the fetal pig dissection, or maybe you just know where it's at, lower abdominal cavity there, and you can sense it when it's beginning to get full. It's kind of an interesting system that you have with your bladder. But first, just a little bit of its structure. There are two sphincters here, an internal and an external sphincter, that control the flow of urine out of the bladder. You don't want a constant trickle coming out of there. You want to be able to hold urine in the bladder until it's convenient to go to the bathroom. And that is, of course, controlled by the nervous system. And there are sensors in your bladder, stretch sensors in your bladder, kind of like in your stomach, that tell your bladder, what its condition is. Your brain is constantly monitoring the condition of your bladder. So your bladder will fill until it's about there's about 200 milliliters in there. And so if you can think of 200 milliliters, I used a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder a number of times, so about 2 of those. It's not a great deal of fluid, but at that point, your bladder stretches, having received that much urine from each of the kidneys. Your bladder will stretch and send a signal to your brain. And the muscle in the wall of the bladder then will contract in response to that, to being that full, to having 200 milliliters in it. And that's the first time you sense that you've got to go to the bathroom. Okay, so that's that urge to urinate, that need to urinate. It's created when it fills to about 200 milliliters. But as you know, you can say no to that. You can resist the urge to urinate. It's uncomfortable for a while, but if you kind of pay attention to it, that urge to urinate subsides after a bit. Okay, so you're saying no, and your brain then kind of gives up, but your bladder continues to fill. About a half hour to an hour later, it will send another signal to the brain. It's getting fuller. Your brain will send a message back to the bladder, and the walls will contract more vigorously, and you'll have to go more. Typically, your bladder holds about 500 milliliters. Okay, and so at some point then your bladder's full enough, you've got a place to go to the bathroom, you're driving and you pull over for gas or whatever, you go to the bathroom, and you can intentionally relax these sphincters and urinate. And oh, what a relief that is, isn't it? Okay, well, sometimes that whole system gets messed up. I always keep track of this with my wife. We have strange table conversations. What's the fullest she's ever seen a bladder? Because when a patient comes in, oftentimes one of the first things they'll do is do a bladder scan to see if they need to be catheterized. Catheterized is sending a tube up the urethra to the bladder to allow the bladder to empty. And there's lots of reasons that that might be required. It might be brain injury, it might be accident, it might be lots of particular reasons. There might be an infection or an inflammation on the urinary tract that causes it to swell to the point where a person can't urinate. The most common one in males is this prostate gland enlargement. Right here in males, particularly as males age, that enlarges and it can pinch off the prostate gland, and you might know grandma. No, grandma doesn't have one. You might know grandpa or great uncle that has had prostate surgery, and that's removal of this gland. And for a while, they'll lose bladder control because they're messing with those sphincters, and but they can regain bladder control. Interestingly enough, prostate glands are also very susceptible to cancer. More men die of prostate cancer on a yearly basis than women die of breast cancer. As a society, we are focused on breast cancer, and I don't have a problem with that. But you need to understand prostate cancer is also a big deal, and it needs to be monitored. So that's what's going on there. So as I mentioned, my wife and I kind of have this little conversation about, most volume in a bladder she's ever seen. I believe her current record is 2,000 milliliters. That's 2 liters. If you can picture a 2-liter pop bottle, and it was a doctor, a physician. He came in, I don't know what his condition was, onto their floor, and she bladder scanned him, and then they catheterized him. I believe it was a urinary tract infection. He couldn't void, he could not urinate, and they pulled 2,000 milliliters out of him. And so the natural response is, well, can the bladder burst? I've heard that in some animals a bladder can actually rupture, like cats. I don't know that for a fact, but I've heard that. I asked my wife about this, and she is unaware, and I've been unable to find out from other sources, of an example of a bladder that has actually burst. What is more likely to happen is this thing fills to the point that it overwhelms these sphincters, and the person urinates maybe when they weren't intending to. Maybe they got startled or surprised and they peed their pants, that kind of thing. These sphincters, however, when the bladder becomes overfull, can actually they become so traumatized that they can't relax. What's the word? Spasming. And they won't relax. Even if the person tries to push some urine out, they won't, because they're so traumatized by the overstretched bladder that they spasm and close off. But that's an unusual situation. One last thing, your textbook has an interesting image. Because bladder cancer is a big deal, and bladder issues in general are a big deal. It's common in this day and age to replace the bladder with either an artificial bladder or with a bladder made from small intestine. But that has some nasty side effects. So about a decade ago, or a little more, there was the next stride was made where researchers were able to take cells from one's own body and cause them to form a new bladder made from the person's own tissue, and then implant that and have it function correctly. I don't know the current state of, whether urologists, those that are dealing with bladder issues, would more likely use an artificial bladder made from a person's small intestine, or whether these grown in a lab situation are more commonly used. No doubt there's a cost calculation that goes along with that as well. But I thought I would just show you that picture from your textbook. Okay, a couple of last things. We've already talked about how hormones like renin will affect your blood pressure by affecting urine. And I wanted to just touch on a couple of other last hormones. One in your notes there is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Okay, now I'm guessing that the term diuretic, is not unfamiliar to all of you. Antidiuretic hormones, so diuretics generally cause you to urinate more. They cause you to produce more urine. So antidiuretic hormone would mean you would urinate less. Well, if you urinate less, that means typically that blood volume is greater. Because remember, if it's not in the nephron, it's going back in the bloodstream. Okay? So your brain, your hypothalamus, we'll talk about where that is another day, it produces antidiuretic hormone. It's actually stored in your pituitary gland, which is also in the brain or associated with the brain. But it affects blood volume. And really it affects the collecting duct. It makes the collecting duct more permeable, and by permeable I mean full of holes, able to let water through. Back when we talked about renin, I very briefly said one of the effects of renin is to produce more aldosterone. That's another hormone, and that makes your nephron move salt into the tissues and blood outside of the nephron. Well, if there's salt, water wants to go there. This is how it gets there. Antidiuretic comes along, makes your collecting duct more full of holes, water moves out, blood volume increases, urine output decreases. Remember, if it leaves the nephron, it's going into the blood. If there's more blood, there's more blood volume, there's more blood pressure. Okay? So some common diuretics would include alcohol and caffeine, among others that are listed there. And again, diuretics are going to increase urine flow and thereby decrease blood pressure. And so alcohol does this. Alcohol it's a nasty substance. I'm sorry, folks, it is. I know it's popular. I know it's commonly accepted. I know we have vilified tobacco use, and it's bad, definitely. But alcohol is no better. It has many effects on the brain. Well, this is sort of a less important one, but it is an important effect. It inhibits the secretion of antidiuretic hormone, so it's going to affect that hypothalamus, and you're going to produce less antidiuretic hormone. That means your collecting ducts are going to be less permeable, let less water out, and that means you're going to have less blood, lower blood pressure. It is a depressant. Alcohol is a depressant. And lower blood volume means greater urine volume. Caffeine does the same thing, but a little differently. It doesn't affect the brain by blocking your body from dumping antidiuretic hormone into the system, but it blocks the effect of antidiuretic hormone, ADH, on the collecting tubes, on that part of the nephron. They become less permeable, more urine, less blood. Okay? And water drinking also affects ADH secretion, and this may be a reason that you are drinking water. But really, your body's trying to maintain a certain blood pressure. So the more water you drink, the less ADH your body produces. Blood volume is maintained. You don't drink as much water, well, your body's going to produce more ADH and maintain a blood volume. But drinking water generally is a very good thing. Now, interestingly enough, this antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. And ladies, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but I kind of have through my 61 years, that women tend to go in the bath, go to the restroom in groups if possible, and men tend to go one at a time. This ADH, which we've already made the case is associated with urine production, it also has a behavioral effect on people. In women, it is shown to have an effect on social behavior and bonding. And maybe that's why you go to bathroom in groups. Well, in men, that same hormone dumped into the male brain is involved with territorialism and boundary determination and marking. So, maybe there's a reason that women go to the bathroom in groups and men go one at a time. Might have something to do with this particular hormone. One last thing, I think this is the last thing I wanted to mention, that there is a mechanism by which your body can lower blood pressure. Of course, it doesn't always completely solve an issue, but it's in the system. If your blood pressure is too high, your atria will sense that, the top chambers on your heart, and they're going to stretch too much because there's too much pressure in the system. If you remember, they were fairly thin-walled. And in response to that excessive stretching, they're going to produce atrial natriuretic hormone. Okay, if you remember, it sounds nasty. Atrial, where it comes from. Natrium is the Latin for salt. And we have already talked about uretic. What it effectively serves to do is block renin, and that whole effect that renin has on angiotensinogen, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, all that stuff, that whole pipeline for raising blood pressure gets blocked, and if it gets blocked, then your blood pressure will fall. And ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone, is a mechanism that your body uses to lower your blood pressure. All right, folks, that's the last lecture on the urinary system. I will have an email out to you with instructions on the exam a little later in the week. Have a good day.